The Renaissance was more than just a period of art and architecture. It was a sweeping transformation, a rebirth that rippled through every aspect of human life. From the ashes of the Middle Ages emerged a new world, where curiosity reigned, where ancient knowledge was rediscovered, and where human potential seemed limitless. It was the dawn of a new era. Tonight, we'll journey through that transformative time, from its origins in 14th century Italy to its spread across Europe. We'll explore not just the towering figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Galileo, but also the quieter forces of change: printing presses, patronage systems, evolving religious thought, and the rediscovery of classical texts. This is the story of how Europe woke up. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let your mind drift back in time. Chapter 1: The World Before the Renaissance. To understand the Renaissance, we must first step back in time, into the long stretch of history known as the Middle Ages. This era, spanning from roughly the 5th to the late 14th century, was defined by tradition, order, and faith. It was a world shaped by the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and for centuries it moved to the rhythm of the church, the feudal system, and the cycles of nature. Europe during the Middle Ages was a fragmented landscape. Kingdoms and principalities were often at war, borders shifted with time, and power was concentrated in the hands of monarchs and lords. Society was rigidly hierarchical. At the top stood kings and nobles. Below them, knights and clergy. And at the bottom, peasants, who made up the vast majority. Life was largely agrarian, with most people tied to the land and dependent on the goodwill of their lords. At the center of this world stood the Catholic Church. It was not only a spiritual authority, but also a cultural, political, and economic force. Monasteries preserved the knowledge of antiquity, even as they prioritized theology over secular learning. Cathedrals rose skyward as symbols of divine order, their stained glass windows telling stories to the illiterate masses below. The intellectual climate of the Middle Ages was dominated by scholasticism, a method of learning that attempted to reconcile faith with reason, but remained tethered to religious doctrine. Questions about the natural world, morality, and the universe were all filtered through the lens of scripture. Art during this time was primarily religious. Painters and sculptors sought to glorify God, not to reflect the physical world. Figures were often stiff, flat, and symbolic. Realism and individuality were largely absent. Beauty was divine, not human. The world view was geocentric. Earth stood at the center of creation, and humanity's role was to serve God and prepare for the afterlife. Curiosity was tempered by caution, and progress came slowly. Yet, beneath this seemingly static world, quiet shifts were occurring. Trade routes with the East brought new goods and new ideas. Islamic scholars had preserved and expanded upon the works of Greek philosophers and scientists. In the great libraries of Cordoba, Baghdad, and Cairo, knowledge flourished, and slowly these ideas began to trickle back into Europe. By the 13th century, universities had begun to emerge, first in Bologna, then Paris, Oxford, and Cambridge. These centers of learning still operated under the influence of the church, but they planted seeds of inquiry that would grow in time. The Middle Ages were not dark, but they were inward. They looked to God, to tradition, and to the past. The Renaissance, when it came, would turn the gaze outward, toward humanity, toward nature, and toward the future. Chapter 2: Why Italy Became the Birthplace of the Renaissance. The Renaissance did not emerge in all of Europe at once. It was born in Italy, in the sun-drenched cities of Florence, Venice, Rome, and Milan. But why Italy? Why here and why then? The answer begins with geography. Italy lies at the heart of the Mediterranean, a natural crossroads between east and west. Its ports buzzed with activity. Goods from the east flowed in, including silks, spices, and precious stones. But with these goods came stories, technologies, and books. Italy was not isolated. It was cosmopolitan, open, and alive. Next came economics. The rise of trade and commerce in the late Middle Ages created a wealthy merchant class. Cities like Venice and Genoa built maritime empires. Florence became a center of banking and textiles. Wealth, in turn, fostered patronage. Rich families, new money, not just nobility, invested in culture. They built churches, sponsored painters, and supported scholars. They saw art and learning not only as noble pursuits, but as reflections of civic pride and personal legacy. Then there was the past. Italy, unlike Northern Europe, was strewn with the ruins of antiquity. Romans had once ruled these lands, and their remnants were everywhere: columns, aqueducts, amphitheaters, and inscriptions. The people of Italy could see their heritage in stone. It reminded them of a time when their ancestors had built empires, composed epics, and debated philosophy. The Renaissance, meaning rebirth, was, in part, a longing to reconnect with this classical past. One of the most powerful catalysts was the political structure of Italy. Unlike centralized monarchies in France or England, Italy was divided into city-states: Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, and the Papal States, among others. These cities were often at odds, but they competed not only in battle, but in beauty and intellect. They strove to outshine one another in art, architecture, and innovation. Among these, Florence stood out. It was governed by a mix of republican ideals and aristocratic families. Its guilds were powerful. Its citizens were literate and engaged. It became a magnet for talent. At the heart of Florence's rise was a single family, the Medici. Originally bankers, the Medici became de facto rulers of Florence. But they ruled not with swords, but with gold and with vision. They funded churches, employed artists, and established libraries. Under Cosimo de' Medici and later Lorenzo the Magnificent, Florence became the intellectual and artistic center of Europe. But it wasn't just the Medici. Wealthy families throughout Italy became patrons. The Sforza in Milan, the Gonzaga in Mantua, and the popes in Rome all sought to leave their mark. Their patronage turned Italy into a garden of genius. The Renaissance emerged here because Italy had the ingredients: wealth, access, heritage, and freedom. It was not an accident. It was a perfect storm of opportunity and ambition. Chapter 3: How the Black Death Changed Everything. While Italy was poised for transformation, a catastrophe swept across Europe that would paradoxically hasten the rebirth. That catastrophe was the Black Death. The plague arrived in 1347, carried by ships into Sicilian ports. It spread like wildfire, unstoppable and mysterious. Bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic variants killed swiftly. In towns and villages, entire households vanished overnight. By the time the plague had run its course, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people in Europe were dead, nearly a third of the population. The impact was devastating. Cities emptied. Churches overflowed with the dead. Survivors lived in fear. The social fabric frayed. Priests, doctors, and nobles died alongside peasants. No one was immune. But out of this despair came profound change. The massive reduction in population disrupted the feudal order. Labour became scarce, and peasants could now demand wages, mobility, and rights. Many left the countryside for towns. Serfdom weakened. Urbanization accelerated. Psychologically, the plague shook faith in established institutions. The church, once the unshakable pillar of truth, seemed helpless. Many clergy fled or perished. Survivors began to question not only religious authority, but the meaning of life itself. Death had come so swiftly, so indiscriminately. What did it all mean? This crisis of faith did not lead to atheism, but to introspection. People began to focus more on the here and now. There was a new appreciation for earthly beauty, for individual experience, for human potential. Art shifted subtly toward realism, toward emotion, toward humanity.
Moreover, wealth was redistributed. Many who had inherited property or business from deceased relatives suddenly found themselves empowered. Patronage expanded. Artisans, scholars, and thinkers found new audiences.
The Black Death also had an unexpected intellectual effect. With so much death, people turned to books, not just religious texts, but ancient writings, forgotten philosophies, medical treatises. The pursuit of knowledge took on urgency and meaning. In short, the plague broke the old world, and in doing so, cleared the way for something new. It was a crucible of suffering, but also a forge of transformation. Chapter 4: The Power of the Medici Family. As the flames of the Renaissance began to flicker across the hills of Florence, one family stood at its heart, quietly shaping the future through gold, diplomacy, and art. They were not kings, nor warriors, but bankers. Yet their influence would ripple through every corner of Italian society and echo across centuries. They were the Medici. The story begins with Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, who founded the family's banking dynasty in the late 14th century. Giovanni was shrewd, cautious, and deeply pragmatic. Under his leadership, the Medici Bank became one of the most respected and trusted financial institutions in Europe. His success laid the foundation for something far greater than wealth. His son, Cosimo de' Medici, known to history as Cosimo the Elder, was not content with mere riches. He believed in power, yes, but also in learning. He spent enormous sums supporting scholars, artists, and architects. Cosimo commissioned the construction of libraries and sponsored translations of classical texts. He funded the creation of the Medici Palace, designed by Michelozzo, blending grandeur with humanist elegance. Cosimo's philosophy was simple. Influence could be more powerful than authority. He never ruled Florence by title, but his will guided its politics. He kept the city's republic intact while controlling it from behind the scenes. He once said, "You can make more friends with a sack of gold than with a sword." And he used that sack wisely. The Medici legacy reached its golden age under Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent. A poet, philosopher, and diplomat, Lorenzo was the ultimate Renaissance man. He surrounded himself with thinkers and artists, transforming Florence into a radiant beacon of culture. Under Lorenzo's patronage, talents flourished. Botticelli painted the ethereal Primavera and the birth of Venus. A young Michelangelo lived in the Medici household, studying sculpture. Leonardo da Vinci found opportunities in the rich Florentine atmosphere the Medici had nurtured. But the Medici weren't just patrons, they were protectors of thought. Lorenzo used his influence to defend scholars accused of heresy. He fostered philosophical debates, supported the Platonic Academy, and believed in a balance between Christianity and the classical world. The Medici's influence wasn't confined to Florence. In time, they would produce popes, Leo X and Clement VII, and marry into royal families. Their fingerprints can be found on the dome of Florence Cathedral, the Vatican's grand halls, and in the pages of Machiavelli's writings. Yet their power was never permanent. The Medici were exiled and restored multiple times. They navigated political storms, riots, and war. But their greatest legacy was cultural, not political. They nurtured a world where art, science, and philosophy could grow. Without the Medici, the Renaissance might still have happened, but it would not have burned as brightly, or spread as far, or lasted as long. Chapter 5. The Rise of Humanism. At the core of the Renaissance was not a style of painting or a new form of architecture, but a shift in how people saw themselves. That shift was called humanism. Humanism was more than a philosophy. It was a spirit, a way of thinking that placed the human experience, human reason, and human potential at the center of the intellectual universe. Where the medieval mind had been focused on the divine and the eternal, the humanist mind turned its gaze toward the world and the individual. The roots of humanism can be traced to Petrarch, an Italian scholar and poet who lived in the 14th century. Petrarch believed that the wisdom of the ancient Romans and Greeks had been forgotten, buried beneath centuries of theological rigidity. He sought to recover it, not to destroy the church, but to enrich the soul. Petrarch read the works of Cicero and Livy, not just for their content, but for their style. He admired their eloquence, their moral clarity, their celebration of human dignity. He began to write in a similar voice. He climbed mountains, not for pilgrimage, but for contemplation. He kept personal letters and diaries. He valued the self, not in pride, but in wonder. Humanism soon spread to other thinkers. Coluccio Salutati, Leonardo Bruni, and Poggio Bracciolini began scouring monasteries for lost manuscripts. They found works by Plato, Aristotle, and other classical giants. These texts were translated, copied, and discussed in new academies, places where philosophy, language, and ethics were debated with intensity and joy. Humanists revived the study of grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy, known collectively as the Studia Humanitatis. Education shifted from scholastic logic to eloquence and ethics. The goal was no longer just to understand God, but to cultivate virtue and wisdom in this life. Importantly, humanism was not anti-Christian. Many humanists remained devout. They saw classical learning as complementary to faith. They believed that by understanding man, they could better understand the divine image in which he was created. This philosophy transformed art, literature, and even politics. Artists painted the human form with reverence. Writers explored emotion and personality. Statesmen, like Machiavelli, examined power and governance through a secular lens. Humanism gave the Renaissance its heartbeat. It reminded Europe that knowledge was not the sole domain of monks and priests, but the birthright of all curious minds. Chapter 6. Rediscovering Ancient Knowledge. The Renaissance has often been described as a rebirth, but what exactly was being reborn? The answer lies in the crumbling scrolls and dusty volumes of ancient Greece and Rome, civilizations that had once teemed with science, philosophy, literature, and art. For centuries, much of this classical knowledge had been lost to Western Europe, but it had survived, preserved by Islamic scholars, Byzantine librarians, and occasional European monks. Beginning in the 14th century, scholars across Italy began to search for these lost treasures. Poggio Bracciolini, for example, traveled to monastic libraries across Europe. In one remote abbey, he discovered Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, a Roman philosophical poem that explored atomism, mortality, and the structure of the universe. Other works by Plato, Plutarch, Galen, and Archimedes followed. Translation became a noble calling. Greek scholars fleeing the fall of Constantinople brought their manuscripts westward. Men like Marsilio Ficino and George of Trebizond worked tirelessly to bring the words of Plato and Aristotle into Latin, making them accessible to Western thinkers for the first time in centuries. The impact was transformative. Plato's philosophy revived debates about the soul, beauty, and the ideal. Aristotle's logic and ethics reshaped education. Hippocrates and Galen changed the study of medicine. Euclid and Ptolemy laid the groundwork for new astronomical discoveries. Even mathematics, neglected in the medieval world, was revitalized. The works of Pythagoras, Archimedes, and others inspired a new interest in geometry, symmetry, and proportion, ideas that would deeply influence architecture and painting. But rediscovery was not mere replication. Renaissance thinkers did not simply copy the ancients, they challenged them, built upon them, and created something new. Classical knowledge became a launching pad for invention. Libraries grew, schools reformed. Printing presses would soon spread these ideas far beyond the elite. The Renaissance was, at its heart, a marriage between old wisdom and new vision, a dialogue between the ancients and the moderns. And it all began with the patient labor of scholars, hunting through monasteries, breathing life into forgotten pages, and lighting the path forward. Chapter 7. Early Renaissance Art, from Giotto to Masaccio. The Renaissance did not only unfold in philosophy or literature, it found vibrant life in paint, stone, and fresco. And though the heights of Renaissance art are often associated with Da Vinci or Michelangelo, its roots stretch back earlier, to artists who began to reimagine how the world could be seen. At the dawn of the 14th century, a Florentine painter named Giotto di Bondone was quietly transforming art. Born in a time when religious iconography dominated, Giotto broke from the stylized, symbolic traditions of the Byzantine style. His figures had weight, his scenes had depth. His people, not saints floating in golden voids, but real human beings, stood, wept, embraced, and mourned. Giotto's most famous work, the frescoes of the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, told the life of Christ not as a series of divine events, but as deeply human stories. There is tenderness in a mother's face, grief in the slump of a mourner's shoulders. Perspective, though primitive, begins to shape the space. For the first time in centuries, art began to look like life. Giotto's innovations were radical for his time, but the world was not yet ready for a full revolution. That would come in the next century. In the early 1400s, a painter named Masaccio took Giotto's legacy and pushed it into a new realm. He was young, brilliant, and bold. In just a few years of work before his untimely death, Masaccio laid the foundation for Renaissance painting as we know it. His frescoes in the Brancacci Chapel in Florence stunned viewers. In The Tribute Money, Masaccio achieved a level of realism never seen before. Figures stood in natural poses, casting shadows under a logical source of light. Faces showed emotion. Mountains faded into the distance. For the first time, linear perspective, guided by mathematical principles, organized the space. It was not just about technique. Masaccio's art made religious scenes feel immediate, as if they were unfolding just outside your door. Christ walked beside barefoot men. Apostles gestured like neighbors in debate. Heaven had come to earth, not in glory, but in familiarity. These developments marked a departure from medieval ideals. No longer were artists merely craftsmen working for the church. They became intellectuals, innovators, creators of a new visual language. Their goal was not only to glorify God, but to understand man. And so, with brush in hand and geometry in mind, the Renaissance artist was born. Chapter 8. Donatello and the Revival of Sculpture. While painting was beginning its transformation, another form of art emerged from the shadows of the medieval world, sculpture. And leading this revival was Donato di Niccolo di Beto Bardi, known to history simply as Donatello. Donatello was born in Florence in the late 14th century, and by the time he began his work, the influence of classical antiquity was beginning to stir. He studied Roman ruins, read ancient texts, and sought to bring the human body back to life in bronze and marble. His early works show careful study, but it was his later pieces that truly revolutionized the art of sculpture. His David, cast in bronze around 1440, was unlike anything seen in 1,000 years. It was the first freestanding nude statue created since ancient Rome. But this David was not the mighty king depicted by Michelangelo decades later. Donatello's David was youthful, almost delicate, standing with one foot on the severed head of Goliath. His body was relaxed, his expression contemplative. He wore a hat, not a crown. He was graceful, not heroic. This statue was radical. It embraced nudity, not as a symbol of shame, but of beauty. It celebrated the human form in its natural state. It drew directly from ancient Greek ideals, but infused them with Christian symbolism and Renaissance subtlety. Donatello's other works, like the statue of St. Mark and the equestrian statue of Gattamelata in Padua, continued this blend of realism and power. His figures did not float. They stood, walked, spoke. Muscles tensed under skin. Drapery clung to limbs. Eyes gazed with purpose. What set Donatello apart was not only his technical brilliance, but his psychological depth. He captured emotion, sorrow, pride, awe. His sculptures told stories not just through form, but through feeling. He worked in stone, wood, and bronze. He collaborated with architects and goldsmiths. He moved between Florence, Siena, and Padua, leaving his mark across the Italian landscape. Donatello's legacy would shape generations. Without him, there could be no Michelangelo. He taught the Renaissance how to see the body again, not just as flesh and bone, but as spirit and soul made visible. Chapter 9. Brunelleschi and the Invention of Perspective. If art is the mirror of an age, then architecture is its skeleton, the structure upon which beauty and belief are built. And no one reshaped that structure more radically in early Renaissance Italy than Filippo Brunelleschi. Born in Florence in 1377, Brunelleschi was originally trained as a goldsmith, but his mind was drawn not to fine detail, but to vast spaces, to geometry, and to engineering. He traveled to Rome with Donatello to study the ruins of antiquity, measuring columns and domes, sketching aqueducts and basilicas. What he saw there changed him forever. When he returned to Florence, the city was facing a dilemma. The great cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, had been under construction for over a century. Its dome was unfinished. No one knew how to span the enormous space without wooden scaffolding that could not be built. Brunelleschi proposed a bold solution, a double-shell dome built without centering, using a herringbone pattern to hold the bricks in place. It was an engineering marvel. His methods were so advanced and so secretive that he refused to share them fully, fearing sabotage or theft. The dome was completed in 1436. It rose above Florence like a crown of reason and faith, 375 feet tall, a symbol of human achievement. It remains one of the most extraordinary architectural feats in history. But Brunelleschi's contributions did not end there. He revolutionized architecture by reintroducing classical principles, symmetry, proportion, and harmony. His churches, like San Lorenzo and the Pazzi Chapel, were calm, rational spaces filled with light and order. Columns echoed Roman temples. Arches framed sacred spaces. Every line was intentional. Perhaps, most profoundly, Brunelleschi invented linear perspective, a method of representing three-dimensional space on a flat surface using vanishing points and mathematical ratios. This discovery transformed painting forever. Suddenly, artists could create depth, distance, and realism. He demonstrated this with a simple experiment, a painting of the Florence Baptistery. Viewed through a hole with a mirror, the scene aligned perfectly with reality. Space could now be measured and recreated, a new window into the world. Brunelleschi was not merely an architect, he was a visionary. He taught the Renaissance that the divine could be expressed through precision, that beauty could arise from order, and that the ancient wisdom of Rome could be reborn in brick and stone. Chapter 10. Leonardo da Vinci, the Universal Genius. In the history of the Renaissance, few names evoke as much awe, mystery, and admiration as Leonardo da Vinci. He was not only one of the greatest painters of all time, but also a visionary engineer, a pioneering scientist, an anatomist, an architect, and a philosopher. To call him a polymath is accurate, but it still falls short. He was the Renaissance made flesh. Leonardo was born in 1452 in the small town of Vinci near Florence. The illegitimate son of a notary and a peasant woman, he received little formal education in Greek or Latin. But what he lacked in classical schooling, he made up for with an insatiable curiosity and boundless imagination. He apprenticed with Andrea del Verrocchio, a prominent Florentine artist, where he learned the foundations of painting, sculpture, and mechanical design. Even as a teenager, Leonardo's brilliance shone. He contributed to Verrocchio's works, painting an angel with such grace and delicacy that, according to legend, his master never painted again. Leonardo's paintings broke new ground in technique and emotion. His use of sfumato, a soft, smoky blending of tones, created atmospheric depth. His chiaroscuro added dramatic contrast. His figures seemed to breathe. His most iconic works, The Last Supper and Mona Lisa, are masterclasses in composition and mystery. The Last Supper captures not just a sacred moment, but the tension and humanity of each apostle. The Mona Lisa gazes back at the viewer with a smile that has defied explanation for centuries. She is at once intimate and distant, familiar and unknowable. But Leonardo was never content with painting alone. He filled notebook after notebook with sketches, inventions, and observations. He dissected corpses to understand anatomy, drawing muscles, bones, and organs with stunning accuracy. He designed flying machines, bridges, war engines, and water systems, many centuries ahead of their time. He studied the movement of water, the formation of clouds, the flight of birds. He wrote in mirror script, perhaps to guard his ideas. His notes reveal a mind that never rested, always questioned, always sought to understand, not just how the world worked, but why it worked that way. Leonardo worked for dukes, kings, and even the Pope. He designed stage sets, costumes, and fortifications. In his final years, he lived in France under the patronage of King Francis I, who called him the greatest man who ever lived. And yet, for all his brilliance, many of Leonardo's projects remained unfinished. He was often consumed by new ideas before completing the old. But perhaps that is what made him who he was, a man in perpetual pursuit, never satisfied, always searching. Leonardo da Vinci was not just a master of many disciplines. He was a symbol of the Renaissance spirit, that human beings, through observation, imagination, and courage, could come to understand the universe and even remake it. Chapter 11. Michelangelo, Sculptor of the Divine. If Leonardo da Vinci was the mind of the Renaissance, Michelangelo Buonarroti was its soul. Born in 1475 in Caprese, near Florence, Michelangelo was a storm of intensity, driven by faith, genius, and obsession. He carved, painted, and built with a ferocity that seemed to defy human limits. His art was not just beautiful, it was sublime, overwhelming, a glimpse into the divine. Michelangelo was apprenticed as a young boy, but quickly surpassed his teachers. His early sculptures stunned viewers with their realism and emotional power. At just 24, he carved the Pietà, a statue of the Virgin Mary cradling the body of Christ. The marble flows like fabric, Mary's face serene yet sorrowful, the body of Jesus limp and lifelike. It is a masterpiece of tenderness and craftsmanship. Then came the David, carved from a single block of flawed marble, abandoned by other sculptors. Standing over 17 feet tall, Michelangelo's David is not the boy who defeated Goliath, but a titan of human will. Muscles tense, eyes focused, poised for action. It became the symbol of Florence itself, brave, beautiful, and defiant. In painting, Michelangelo was equally monumental. Though he considered himself a sculptor, he was commissioned by Pope Julius II to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The task was immense, over 5,000 square feet of fresco, depicting scenes from Genesis, prophets, sibyls, and more. He worked alone for 4 years, lying on scaffolding, battling exhaustion and self-doubt. The result was a cosmic vision. From the separation of light and darkness to the creation of Adam, where God's outstretched hand nearly touches man's, the ceiling is a theological symphony rendered in color and form. Years later, he returned to the chapel to paint The Last Judgment, a terrifying and magnificent vision of souls rising and falling, saved and damned, swirling in divine judgment. It shocked and awed his contemporaries, challenging both theology and taste. Michelangelo also shaped architecture. He worked on the Medici Chapel, designed the Laurentian Library, and most famously, took over the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. His dome, grander even than Brunelleschi's, dominates the Roman skyline to this day. Unlike Leonardo, Michelangelo was not a man of leisure or courtly charm. He lived simply, worked obsessively, and wrote poetry full of longing and faith. He saw art as a form of worship, a way to reveal the divine spark within the human form. Michelangelo died at 88, having shaped the Renaissance not only with his chisel and brush, but with his fierce belief that beauty was truth, and that in carving the body, one could glimpse the soul. Chapter 12. Raphael and the Perfection of Harmony. While Leonardo was the mind and Michelangelo the soul of the Renaissance, Raphael Sanzio of Urbino was its heart, a master of grace, harmony, and serene beauty. Born in 1483, Raphael was the son of a court painter and grew up surrounded by art and poetry. He absorbed influences with ease, learning from Perugino, Leonardo, and Michelangelo, and blending their strengths into a style uniquely his own. By his early 20s, Raphael was already renowned. He was invited to Rome by Pope Julius II and tasked with decorating the papal apartments in the Vatican. The frescoes he created there, known as the Stanze di Raffaello, remain some of the greatest achievements in Western art. Among them, the School of Athens stands supreme. It is a gathering of ancient philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Pythagoras, placed in an idealized classical setting. The architecture is grand, the composition balanced, the gestures vivid. Raphael even included portraits of Leonardo and Michelangelo disguised as ancient thinkers. The School of Athens is more than a painting. It is a visual manifesto of humanism, the celebration of knowledge, dialogue, and the timeless pursuit of truth. Raphael's Madonnas, particularly the Sistine Madonna, radiate tenderness and maternal grace. His religious works are infused with humanity, accessible yet sacred. Unlike the brooding Michelangelo or the restless Leonardo, Raphael was beloved for his gentle nature and charm. He moved easily among scholars, courtiers, and popes. He was admired not only for his talent, but for his character. Beyond painting, Raphael contributed to architecture. He succeeded Bramante as chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica and worked on urban planning for the city of Rome. He even undertook archaeological efforts, preserving ancient monuments threatened by modern development. Raphael died young, at just 37, but his influence endured. He embodied the Renaissance ideal, the synthesis of learning and beauty, innovation and tradition, intellect and emotion. In Raphael's art, everything is in balance. There is no struggle, only harmony. He showed the world not what it was or what it could be, but what it ought to be, a place of light, wisdom, and peace. Chapter 13, Botticelli and the Mythological Revival. In the flowering gardens of Renaissance Florence, one painter captured the delicate poetry of myth and spirit like no other, Sandro Botticelli. His works shimmer with grace, mystery, and allegory, standing apart from the scientific realism that dominated his time. In Botticelli's world, beauty danced like a whispered dream. Born Alessandro di Mariano di Vanni Filippeppi in 1445, Botticelli trained under Fra Filippo Lippi, absorbing a lyrical style that emphasized line and emotion over structure and anatomy. While others pursued geometric precision, Botticelli sought elegance and atmosphere. He was, in a sense, a poet with a brush. His most famous works, The Birth of Venus and Primavera, break from Christian themes to explore the mythology of ancient Greece and Rome, an unusual choice in a deeply religious era. These paintings were not mere fantasies. They reflected the intellectual circles of Florence, particularly those influenced by Neoplatonism, a philosophy that blended classical thought with Christian spirituality. The Birth of Venus shows the goddess emerging from the sea, standing upon a shell, as the winds blow her to shore and a nymph offers her a cloak. Venus is not portrayed as a temptress, but as an ideal, a symbol of divine love, purity, and beauty. Her body is softly elongated, her expression serene. The scene is ethereal, suspended between worlds. Primavera, or spring, is even more enigmatic. In a lush orange grove, figures dance and converse. Venus at the center, Mercury dispelling clouds, the three graces in delicate motion, and Zephyrus pursuing the nymph Chloris. Every detail is symbolic of love, transformation, knowledge, and renewal. Scholars continue to debate its meaning, but its spell is undeniable.
Botticelli also created deeply religious works, including the Adoration of the Magi, the Mystic Nativity, and numerous Madonnas. His religious paintings are meditative, infused with sorrow and longing. Later in life, Botticelli fell under the influence of the fiery preacher Savonarola, whose sermons condemned vanity and secular art. Some believe Botticelli even burned some of his paintings during the infamous Bonfire of the Vanities. His style darkened, his colors faded, and he gradually faded from fame. Yet his legacy endured. Botticelli's art represents a unique moment in the Renaissance, a space where myth and meaning, grace and allegory floated freely. In his lines and gestures,
we see not the logic of perspective, but the rhythm of music, the movement of poetry, the breath of something timeless. Chapter 14: Renaissance Architecture and the Classical Legacy. As painters brought light to canvas and sculptors gave soul to stone, architects were reshaping the spaces in which people lived, prayed, and dreamed. Renaissance architecture was not merely construction, it was a conscious revival of ancient principles, fused with new ideals of harmony, proportion, and civic pride. At the heart of this architectural rebirth was the rediscovery of Vitruvius, a Roman architect whose treatise De Architectura emphasized symmetry, geometry, and functionality. Vitruvius believed that architecture should reflect the order of the natural world, and that buildings, like the human body, should be balanced and harmonious. Brunelleschi had already begun this revival with his dome for Florence Cathedral and his serene churches, but others would follow and expand the vision. Leon Battista Alberti, a true Renaissance polymath, wrote influential works on art and architecture. He saw buildings as living organisms, each part in harmony with the whole. His churches, like Sant'Andrea in Mantua, featured grand facades, barrel vaults, and triumphal arches inspired by ancient Rome. He introduced the idea that architecture could be a form of intellectual and moral expression. In Florence, Michelozzo designed the Medici Palace with a sense of restraint and dignity. Its rough stone base gave way to elegant windows and cornices, reflecting the values of strength and grace. The building was not just a home, it was a statement. In Rome, the church became the greatest patron of architecture. Pope Nicholas V, and later Julius II and Leo X, embarked on vast projects to restore the glory of the city. Temples became churches, forums became piazzas, ruins became inspirations. The Vatican was transformed into a symbol of papal majesty. Andrea Palladio, working in the Venetian Republic, brought Renaissance architecture to its classical zenith. His villas and churches, inspired by Roman temples, emphasized symmetry, clarity, and proportion. His book, The Four Books of Architecture, became a foundational text, influencing generations of builders from England to America. Renaissance cities also changed. Urban planning emerged as a discipline. Streets were widened, squares were created, sightlines aligned with monumental buildings. Architecture was no longer just about function. It was about civic identity, human dignity, and spiritual aspiration. Columns returned, domes rose, facades became rational, ordered, symmetrical. Light played across marble and stucco. Spaces invited reflection, movement, and awe. Renaissance architecture was the embodiment of the era's values. It looked to the past, embraced the present, and imagined a future where beauty and reason could coexist. Chapter 15: The Printing Press and the Spread of Knowledge. Among the many inventions of the Renaissance, none would change the world more profoundly or more quietly than the printing press. Developed around 1440 by Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz, Germany, the printing press transformed how knowledge was created, shared, and preserved. Before Gutenberg, books were handwritten. A single volume could take months, even years, to produce. They were expensive, rare, and often chained to desks in libraries. Literacy was limited to the clergy and the elite. The written word moved slowly, like a whisper in a crowded room. Gutenberg's innovation, movable type, allowed individual letters to be rearranged and reused. Combined with oil-based ink and a mechanical press, this method revolutionized printing. Texts could now be produced rapidly, accurately, and in large numbers. The first major printed book, the Gutenberg Bible, appeared in 1455. Its clarity and beauty amazed readers. But the real power of the press lay not in sacred texts, but in its potential to democratize knowledge. Within decades, presses sprang up across Europe, in Italy, France, England, and beyond. Printers published religious works, classical texts, scientific treatises, poetry, and political pamphlets. Ideas that had once lived in cloisters and courts now traveled by carriage and foot, crossing borders and languages. The Renaissance thirst for ancient wisdom was quenched as Greek and Roman texts were printed and distributed. Humanist scholars saw their works reach wider audiences. Artists and architects studied pattern books and treatises. Scientists compared notes across countries. Perhaps most significantly, the printing press changed education. Grammar schools expanded. Universities updated curricula. Literacy rates climbed. People read not just for information, but for pleasure and reflection. The press also challenged authority. The church no longer controlled the written word. Vernacular translations of the Bible allowed individuals to interpret scripture themselves. This shift would eventually fuel the fires of the Reformation. Censorship, of course, followed. Governments and religious leaders feared the spread of dangerous ideas. But the genie was out of the bottle. The printed word had become a force of change, quiet, persistent, and unstoppable. In the hum of the press, the Renaissance found its voice. It was the sound of curiosity multiplied, of wisdom spreading, of humanity waking to a new world made from ink and paper. Chapter 16. Erasmus and the Philosophy of the North. While Italy basked in the warmth of classical revival, another current of the Renaissance flowed quietly to the north. Here, amid the cool stone cathedrals and windswept towns of the Low Countries and Germany, a different kind of humanism took root. One that prized ethics over eloquence, inner virtue over outward display. At the heart of this movement stood a single man, Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam. Born in 1466, Erasmus was the illegitimate son of a priest and raised in relative obscurity. He entered a monastery, but soon grew disenchanted with its rigidity. A scholar at heart, he longed for learning that inspired the soul rather than silenced it. Through sheer talent, he made his way to the intellectual centers of Europe, Paris, Louvain, Basel, and beyond. Erasmus became a leading figure in what is now known as Christian humanism. Like his Italian counterparts, he revered the classics. But for Erasmus, the true wisdom of antiquity was not in its rhetoric, but in its moral clarity. He believed that knowledge should serve virtue, and that the life of the mind must lead to a better heart. His most famous work, The Praise of Folly, published in 1511, was a biting satire. Through humor and irony, Erasmus exposed the corruption of the church, the vanity of scholars, and the emptiness of ritual without understanding. But his criticism was not born of cynicism. It was the plea of a man who loved his faith deeply and wanted to see it purified, not abandoned. Erasmus also produced a critical edition of the New Testament in Greek, alongside a new Latin translation. This work was monumental. It returned scripture to its roots, revealing textual errors, clarifying meanings, and urging a return to Christ's teachings. It laid the foundation for theological reform, not through revolt, but through renewal. Though often associated with the Protestant Reformation, Erasmus remained within the Catholic Church. He believed in change, but not schism. He corresponded with Luther, supported reform, yet recoiled from the extremism and violence that followed. His ideal was a church reformed from within, a vision that, tragically, was overtaken by events. Erasmus was a man of letters, not power. He refused positions of authority, choosing instead the life of a wandering scholar. He lived simply, travelled often, and wrote prolifically. His works, published across Europe, were among the first bestsellers of the printing age. He died in 1536, respected by princes and popes, though fully claimed by neither. In him, the Northern Renaissance found its conscience. In his words, the Renaissance remembered its soul. Chapter 17. The Northern Renaissance. A different flavor. The Renaissance may have begun in Italy, but it did not end there. As ideas traveled northward, carried by merchants, scholars, and the press, they took root in new soil and bloomed in new ways. The Northern Renaissance, particularly in regions like Flanders, Germany, and England, was shaped by its own traditions, its own climate, and its own concerns. While Italian artists looked to classical mythology and idealized forms, Northern artists focused on detail, realism, and the world around them. Their canvases were filled with texture, fur-lined robes, polished armor, reflective surfaces. Every wrinkle, every leaf, every glint of light was rendered with painstaking precision. This difference was not just stylistic, it reflected deeper currents. In the North, religion remained central. The reforming spirit of Christian humanism influenced both content and tone. Artists and writers alike explored spiritual themes, not through grand gestures, but through intimate, contemplative scenes. Architecture, too, took a different path. While Italy revived Roman columns and domes, Northern Europe clung to the verticality of the Gothic. Spires rose like prayers into the sky. Interiors were shadowed, mystical, echoing with the past. Yet even here, Renaissance principles crept in: proportion, order, light. In literature, figures like Thomas More, Francois Rabelais, and William Shakespeare brought Renaissance ideas into dialogue with local traditions. They explored politics, faith, folly, and love in ways that spoke to their own lands and languages. The Northern Renaissance was also marked by a growing sense of individualism. Portraiture flourished, not just of nobility, but of merchants, scholars, and even peasants. Artists captured their sitters not as types, but as personalities. A furrowed brow, a sidelong glance, a weathered hand, these became signs of a person's inner life. This Renaissance was quieter, colder, more introspective, but it was no less profound. It was a mirror to its time, a world on the edge of religious upheaval, political change, and intellectual awakening. And in the hands of its greatest artists, it would achieve a kind of sacred realism unmatched in history. Chapter 18. Dürer, Van Eyck, and the Rise of Detail. Two names stand at the summit of Northern Renaissance art: Jan van Eyck and Albrecht Dürer. Though separated by time and space, Van Eyck in the early 15th century in the Low Countries, Dürer in the late 15th and early 16th century in Germany, both elevated the art of detail to new and astonishing heights. Jan van Eyck was a pioneer. Working in Bruges, he developed techniques in oil painting that would revolutionize the medium. Oils allowed for richer colors, finer lines, and layers of translucent glaze. Van Eyck used this to stunning effect. His Arnolfini portrait remains one of the most enigmatic paintings ever made. A wealthy couple stands in a richly appointed room. The textures are exquisite: the sheen of glass, the fur of a robe, the polish of wood. A mirror behind them reflects the entire scene, including two mysterious figures. Every object, fruit, candle, dog, is symbolic, and yet it feels entirely real. Van Eyck's religious works are equally compelling. The Ghent altarpiece, created with his brother Hubert, is a polyptych of overwhelming complexity and spiritual grandeur. Saints, angels, prophets, and a radiant Christ gaze out with piercing realism. It is a vision of heaven rendered in earthly clarity. Albrecht Dürer, born in Nuremberg in 1471, brought the northern and Italian traditions together. A master of engraving, woodcut, and painting, Dürer traveled to Italy and absorbed the principles of proportion, anatomy, and perspective. He returned home and synthesized them with German precision. His self-portraits are revolutionary, direct, confident, almost confrontational. He depicts himself not as a mere artisan, but as a creator, a thinker. His famous Melancholia Why is a complex allegory of creativity and melancholy, filled with mysterious symbols, geometrical tools, and philosophical depth. Dürer's religious prints, like the Apocalypse or the Passion, circulated widely, bringing powerful images to people across Europe. His art was both deeply personal and broadly influential. What united Van Eyck and Dürer was their commitment to seeing, not just to representing reality, but to understanding it, honoring it, exploring its textures and truths. They painted not with broad strokes, but with reverent focus. Every blade of grass, every fold of cloth, every wrinkle of time. In their hands, the Renaissance took on a new form, less theatrical, more introspective, less sunlit, more shadowed, but always, always committed to the beauty of the real. Chapter 19, Renaissance Music, the soundtrack of change. As painters filled chapels with luminous color and writers gave voice to new philosophies, another Renaissance unfolded, not in pigment or parchment, but in sound. The Renaissance was not only seen and read, it was heard, and its music, subtle and sublime, carried the rhythms of a world in transformation. In the medieval world, music had been largely the domain of the church. Gregorian chant dominated, monophonic, solemn, sacred. But by the 15th century, polyphony began to bloom. Multiple independent vocal lines wove together, creating rich textures of harmony and emotion. Music became not just a tool for worship, but an art of its own. At the forefront of this shift were composers from the Franco-Flemish school, figures like Guillaume Dufay, Josquin des Prez, and Johannes Ockeghem. Their works combined mathematical complexity with emotional resonance. Sacred masses soared with layered melodies, while secular chansons captured courtly love, longing, and celebration. Josquin, in particular, was revered. Martin Luther called him the master of the notes. His music balanced structure with expression. In his motets, voices echo each other like prayers in a cathedral. In his masses, motifs travel from one line to another, building themes of spiritual reflection. The invention of music printing in the early 16th century by Ottaviano Petrucci brought these works to a wider audience. No longer confined to cathedrals and courts, music began to circulate like books, learned, taught, and performed across Europe. In Italy, the madrigal emerged, a secular vocal form blending poetry and polyphony. Composers like Claudio Monteverdi and Luca Marenzio explored human emotion through voice alone. Love, jealousy, grief, and delight were all given musical form, sung in gardens, salons, and gatherings. Instrumental music also began to flourish. The lute, viol, harpsichord, and early keyboard instruments gained prominence. Composers wrote dance suites, preludes, and fantasies. Music moved from being exclusively sacred to a part of everyday life. Renaissance music was not loud. It was not bold. It was gentle, intricate, often intimate. It was a companion to thought, to prayer, to courtship. It was the sound of transition, from the medieval to the modern, from the cosmic to the human. In this era, music became a mirror of the soul, echoing the Renaissance itself in its beauty, balance, and boundless curiosity. Chapter 20. Women of the Renaissance, Power and Silence. The Renaissance was a time of great men: Leonardo, Michelangelo, Erasmus, Machiavelli. But behind and between their stories are the quieter, often obscured lives of women. Though their voices were often silenced, their presence shaped the world in ways both subtle and profound. Women in the Renaissance faced many constraints. Education was largely reserved for boys. Marriage, often arranged, determined their fate. Laws and customs limited their freedom. And yet, within these bounds, many women found ways to participate, create, and even lead. Some, like Isabella d'Este of Mantua, wielded political power. Isabella was a patron of the arts, a collector, and a diplomat. Her court attracted artists, writers, and musicians. She commissioned portraits, supported classical studies, and corresponded with the leading minds of her day. She was known as the First Lady of the Renaissance. Others, like Caterina Sforza, were warriors. After her husband's assassination, Caterina took control of Imola and Forli, defending her children and her lands with ferocity. Her courage became legend, her image painted in both admiration and controversy. Women also contributed to literature. Christine de Pizan, born in Venice and raised in France, wrote the Book of the City of Ladies, a defense of women's intelligence, virtue, and potential. She challenged misogyny with reason and elegance, creating a space for female dignity in a male-dominated world. Poets like Gaspara Stampa and Vittoria Colonna wrote with depth and grace. Their verses expressed love, loss, faith, and intellect. Colonna, a close friend of Michelangelo, was widely respected for her spiritual poetry and moral insight. In art, a few women rose to prominence despite barriers. Sofonisba Anguissola, trained in Cremona, became court painter to Philip II of Spain. Lavinia Fontana and Artemisia Gentileschi painted powerful works, often depicting strong, defiant women. Gentileschi's Judith slaying Holofernes is a vivid, visceral act of storytelling and reclamation. Women also contributed to the household arts: embroidery, music, herbal medicine, education, often unrecorded but deeply influential. Mothers taught their sons, wives advised their husbands, sisters shared books and stories. And yet most women remained invisible to history, illiterate, nameless, confined. Their silence is part of the Renaissance story too, a reminder of how far even the brightest ages fall short of justice. But in the margins, in the salons, in the letters and brushstrokes and melodies, women left their mark. Their influence, often hidden, was no less vital. They were the breath beneath the brilliance, the quiet thread in the grand tapestry. Chapter 21. Science Awakens. Copernicus and the New Cosmos. Amid the frescoes and sonnets, a quiet revolution was taking place. Not in cathedrals or palaces, but in observatories and study rooms. It was a revolution of the stars, the earth, and the very structure of the universe. And it began with a Polish cleric named Nicholas Copernicus. For centuries, the Ptolemaic model had ruled. The Earth was the center of the cosmos, unmoving, orbited by the sun, moon, and planets. This geocentric view was not just scientific. It was theological, philosophical, and deeply ingrained. But Copernicus, born in 1473 in Torun, studied the heavens with care. He read ancient texts, observed celestial motions, and found inconsistencies in the Ptolemaic system. He proposed something radical, that the earth revolved around the sun. In his 1543 work, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, Copernicus laid out a heliocentric model of the universe. It was elegant, simpler, and more accurate in explaining planetary motion. But it upended everything. If Earth moved, then the heavens were not fixed. If the sun stood still, then mankind was not at the center. The implications were philosophical and spiritual. The cosmos was suddenly vast, dynamic, and less certain. Copernicus was cautious. His book was published at the end of his life, with a preface suggesting it was merely a hypothesis. But the seed had been planted. In the decades that followed, astronomers like Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler, and Galileo Galilei would expand, prove, and defend the heliocentric model. Kepler discovered that planets moved in ellipses, not perfect circles. Galileo, with his telescope, observed moons orbiting Jupiter and phases of Venus, direct evidence that not all bodies circled Earth. This new science clashed with church doctrine, leading to trials, censure, and controversy. Galileo was forced to recant, books were banned, yet the movement continued. The Renaissance had awakened not only art and literature, but inquiry itself. Nature became a subject of study, not just wonder. Mathematics, physics, and observation emerged as tools of truth. The world was no longer a divine mystery, it was a puzzle to be solved. Copernicus did not seek to dethrone humanity or challenge faith. He sought clarity. But in looking to the stars, he helped humanity take its first step toward modern science. And the universe, once still and small, opened its arms to infinite possibilities. Chapter 22: Machiavelli and the Politics of Power. In a world bursting with beauty and rebirth, there also lurked intrigue, betrayal, and ambition. The Renaissance, for all its light, cast deep shadows, none deeper than those observed and recorded by Niccolò Machiavelli, a Florentine diplomat, thinker, and the father of modern political science. Born in 1469 in the Republic of Florence, Machiavelli served in a time of shifting alliances and violent change. He was a civil servant, a negotiator, and a keen observer of human behavior. He traveled on behalf of the Florentine government, meeting princes and popes, witnessing firsthand the games of power and diplomacy. When the Medici family regained control of Florence in 1512, Machiavelli was dismissed, imprisoned, and tortured. Upon release, he retreated to the countryside and began to write. It was during this exile that he composed Il Principe, The Prince. The book, published posthumously in 1532, shocked and fascinated its readers. Gone were the idealisms of classical philosophy. In their place was a stark, unsentimental analysis of how rulers actually behave, and how they must behave to maintain power. Machiavelli wrote that it is better to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both, that a prince must be cunning like a fox and strong like a lion, that appearances matter more than truth, and that the ends often justify the means. These ideas were not prescriptions of evil, but observations of reality. Machiavelli sought to describe, not dictate. He believed that in a corrupt world, morality alone could not preserve stability. A wise ruler, he argued, must learn how to act immorally when necessary. But Machiavelli was no monster. In his other works, such as Discourses on Livy, he praised republican government, civic virtue, and citizen engagement. He loved his city and dreamed of its greatness. He admired the ancient Romans, not for their cruelty, but for their discipline and public spirit. Machiavelli's legacy is complex. Some see him as a cynic, others as a realist. He was reviled, misunderstood, and eventually embraced by thinkers across the spectrum, from autocrats to revolutionaries. What he revealed, above all, was that politics is not a realm of ideals, but of choices. Difficult, often painful choices. His honesty remains bracing, his insights unsettling. In a time of art and faith, Machiavelli reminded the world of power's cold logic. He died in 1527, largely forgotten by his city. But his writings endured, whispering to every generation, "Power does not forgive ignorance. Understand it, or be undone by it." Chapter 23: The Reformation and the Fracturing of Unity. As the Renaissance awakened minds and spread ideas across Europe, it also sparked tensions that had long lain dormant. The Church, once unchallenged in its authority, found itself facing scrutiny from scholars, priests, and ordinary believers. The unity of Christendom, built over 1,000 years, began to fracture. At the heart of this upheaval was Martin Luther, a German monk and theologian. In 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church. His challenge was clear: the sale of indulgences, payments for the forgiveness of sins, was corrupt, unbiblical, and an affront to true faith. Luther's protest resonated far beyond Germany. Thanks to the printing press, his writings spread rapidly. He argued that salvation came by faith alone, not works, that Scripture, not church tradition, was the ultimate authority, that every believer had direct access to God. What began as reform quickly became revolution. The Pope excommunicated Luther. The Holy Roman Emperor condemned him, but he refused to recant. Protected by sympathetic princes, Luther continued to write, translate the Bible into German, and build a new vision of Christianity. Others followed. John Calvin in Geneva preached predestination and discipline. Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich sought to simplify worship. The Anabaptists rejected infant baptism. Across Europe, churches split, doctrines diverged, and religious wars erupted. England took its own path. King Henry VIII, initially a critic of Luther, broke with Rome when denied an annulment. He declared himself head of the Church of England, initiating a national reformation driven by both faith and power. The Reformation was not just theological, it was cultural, political, and social. It empowered rulers to challenge papal authority. It encouraged literacy as people sought to read the Bible. It fostered dissent, debate, and diversity. But it also brought violence. Wars of religion scarred Europe for generations. Persecution, exile, and execution became common. Catholics and Protestants saw each other as heretics, not brethren. Yet out of this chaos, new energies emerged. Education expanded, churches reformed, music, art, and literature adapted. The Renaissance spirit of inquiry, of return to sources, of individual conscience continued even in conflict. The Reformation marked the end of medieval unity, but it also signaled the beginning of modern faith, a faith more personal, more varied, and, for better or worse, forever changed. Chapter 24: Venice and the Renaissance of Colour. While Florence was the cradle of intellectual rebirth and Rome the seat of grandeur, Venice offered something different: light, reflection, and colour. The city on water produced a school of painting that shimmered with sensuality and emotion, a Renaissance less concerned with line and more attuned to the human senses. Venice was a republic of merchants, sailors, and diplomats. Its wealth came from trade, its culture from the mingling of East and West. Byzantine mosaics adorned its basilicas. Spices and silks filled its markets. It was a place of opulence, but also refinement. Venetian painters embraced oil like no others. The damp climate made fresco unreliable. So canvases and rich pigments became their tools. They layered color upon color, creating depth, texture, and atmosphere that felt alive. Giovanni Bellini was among the first to define the Venetian style. His Madonnas and altarpieces glow with tenderness and calm. He painted light as if it were sacred, bathing his figures in golden warmth. His student, Giorgione, brought a new lyricism. His The Tempest remains one of the most enigmatic works of the period, a mysterious landscape with a nursing mother, a soldier, and a brewing storm. Its meaning is unclear, but its mood is unforgettable. Then came Titian, Tiziano Vercelli, the undisputed master of Venetian painting. His portraits radiated character. His mythological scenes pulsed with life. His religious works burned with passion. Titian painted emperors, popes, and gods with the same intensity, infusing them with humanity and grandeur. He used color not just for beauty, but for structure. His brushwork became looser with age, almost impressionistic. Flesh, fabric, sky, they swirled together in dynamic harmony. His Assumption of the Virgin, hanging in the Frari Church, lifts the viewer into a realm of divine ecstasy. Venice's painters also influenced Europe beyond Italy. Tintoretto, with his bold compositions and dramatic lighting, prefigured the Baroque. Veronese dazzled with theatrical pageants and grand feasts. In Venice, the Renaissance became more than reason. It became sensation. Color replaced contour. Emotion replaced clarity. And in the shimmer of oil, the soul of a city found its voice. Chapter 25. The Renaissance in Spain, El Greco and Mysticism. In the sun-drenched plateaus and fortress cities of Spain, the Renaissance wore a different face. Here, the cultural revival blended with deep religious intensity, Gothic echoes, and a growing empire's stern majesty. And amid the gold of cathedrals and the silence of cloisters, one artist emerged to shape a vision all his own, El Greco. Born Domenikos Theotokopoulos in Crete in 1541, El Greco trained in the Byzantine icon tradition before moving to Venice, where he absorbed the color and drama of Titian and Tintoretto. He journeyed to Rome, studied classical sculpture, and eventually made his way to Spain, where he settled in Toledo, a city of stone, spirit, and shadows. El Greco's art defies categorization. It is Renaissance in its refinement, mannerist in its elongation, and mystical in its energy. His figures stretch upward, eyes ablaze, hands outstretched. Light falls in strange ways. Colors swirl and tremble. Nothing is static. Everything ascends. His Burial of the Count of Orgaz, painted in 1586, is a masterpiece of spiritual duality. The lower half depicts a nobleman's burial with somber realism, draped robes, grieving faces, candlelight. Above, heaven opens in luminous chaos. Angels spiral, saints hover, Christ reigns in radiance. The earthly and the divine are stitched together by faith and vision. El Greco's style puzzled his contemporaries. Some admired his emotion. Others dismissed him as eccentric. But his influence would stretch far into the future. Modernists like Picasso and Cézanne saw in him a precursor to abstraction, to expressionism, to freedom. Beyond El Greco, Spain's Renaissance flourished in literature and architecture. Writers like Garcilaso de la Vega brought Italian poetic forms to Spanish language. Mystics like Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross penned ecstatic visions of union with God, blending reason with rapture. Architects fused Gothic structure with Renaissance proportion. The monastery of El Escorial,
designed by Juan de Herrera, stands as a monument to Spanish power and piety, severe, vast, and austere. The Spanish Renaissance was not light-hearted. It was intense, inward, devout. It gazed not at Apollo's harmony, but at Christ's suffering. And in the hands of El Greco, it found a language of flame, shadow, and unearthly grace. Chapter 26. The role of patronage, Medici, popes, and power. Behind the soaring domes, radiant paintings, and marble heroes of the Renaissance stood a quieter force. Money, art, for all its ideals, needed support. And the patrons of the Renaissance, whether wealthy families, princely courts, or religious institutions, were as instrumental to its flowering as the artists themselves. Nowhere was this more evident than in Florence, where the Medici family ruled not by title, but by wealth. Bankers to kings and popes, the Medici used their fortune to shape the city's destiny. Cosimo de' Medici supported Brunelleschi, Donatello, and Fra Angelico. His grandson, Lorenzo il Magnifico, nurtured Botticelli, Michelangelo, and the young Leonardo. Their patronage was not just generosity, it was power, image, and immortality. A fresco in a chapel, a statue in a square, a library of ancient texts, all declared their influence. They turned Florence into a stage for prestige and a laboratory of genius. In Rome, the papacy became the Renaissance's greatest benefactor. Popes like Julius II and Leo X commissioned grand projects to restore the city's glory. Julius hired Bramante to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica. He summoned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel. Raphael was tasked with decorating papal apartments. These works were expressions of faith, but also of authority. The church sought to demonstrate its divine favor through beauty. Cathedrals became theaters of light and awe. Paintings preached with color and form. Outside Italy, courts played a similar role. In France, King Francis I brought Leonardo to the Château de Chambord. In England, Henry VIII commissioned music, poetry, and palaces. In the German states, princes and bishops sponsored altarpieces and libraries. Even private citizens participated. Merchants, guilds, and city councils funded chapels, sculptures, and public fountains. Art became part of civic identity and spiritual devotion. This system of patronage had its complexities. Artists were often bound to the whims of their patrons, their creativity shaped by commissions. But it also allowed them to work, to experiment, to achieve greatness. The Renaissance was not born in isolation. It was built by networks of money, power, taste, and vision. Without patrons, the marble remained uncarved. With them, the world was remade in beauty. Chapter 27. Renaissance Gardens, Nature in Harmony. As the Renaissance unfolded in paint, marble, and manuscript, it also quietly flourished under open skies, in gardens where human hands shaped nature into philosophy. These gardens were more than retreats. They were living expressions of balance, beauty, and the classical order reimagined in the green. The Renaissance garden was born of a simple yet profound idea, that nature, when ordered by reason, could reflect the divine harmony of the universe. This belief, inherited from ancient Roman sources and filtered through humanist ideals, found expression in terraces, fountains, hedges, and orchards. A garden was a canvas, not wild, but cultivated, not spontaneous, but composed. In cities like Florence and Rome, noble families commissioned vast gardens as extensions of their villas. The layout followed geometric principles, squares and circles, straight paths and axis lines, all aligned with mathematical precision. Symmetry was not just pleasing, it was a symbol of intellectual and moral control over chaos. The Villa d'Este in Tivoli
is among the most iconic of these landscapes. Its garden cascades down the hillside in a series of terraces, each alive with fountains that sing and grottos that whisper. Statues of gods and heroes nestle among flowers and ivy. Every element, from the sound of flowing water to the shimmer of sunlight on a reflecting pool, was curated to evoke wonder, contemplation, and serenity. Elsewhere, at the Boboli Gardens in Florence, hedged corridors lead to hidden alcoves. Stone amphitheatres face open lawns. Cypress trees tower like sentinels of peace. Even the trees seem to align with the stars. These were not just leisure spaces. They were philosophical statements. Gardens symbolized man's capacity to shape the world with reason and restraint. They stood in contrast to the wildness of the medieval forest, a world feared, dark, untamed. In the Renaissance garden, nature was no longer something to flee from, but something to understand, sculpt, and walk among. And while these green realms were enjoyed by the wealthy elite, their influence trickled down. Even modest households planted herb gardens with symmetry in mind. Monasteries, too, adopted Renaissance design in their cloisters and orchard layouts, blending spirituality with order. The garden became a metaphor for Eden restored, for the mind disciplined, for the soul at rest. Tonight, as your thoughts settle, picture a pathway beneath cypress trees, flanked by stone statues half covered in moss. Imagine the quiet murmur of a fountain in moonlight, the cool scent of lavender, and the gentle gravel underfoot. Let the peace of those gardens guide you inward, where harmony awaits. Chapter 28: Renaissance Fashion and the Art of Dress. In the Renaissance, the human body was not merely clothed. It was adorned, sculpted, and framed with intentionality. Fashion became a canvas of identity, a mirror of power, and a silent conversation between tradition and change. From the wool markets of Florence to the courts of Spain and the salons of France, the art of dress revealed who you were before you ever spoke. Wealth, gender, age, marital status, political loyalty, even your moral values, all were encoded in textiles and tailoring. Men's clothing evolved from the more utilitarian medieval garb into elaborately constructed outfits. Doublets were padded and cinched to emphasize the shoulders and chest, projecting strength and structure. Sleeves were detachable, often slashed to reveal colorful underlayers. Hose clung tightly to the legs, and codpieces became exaggerated, both for modesty and bravado. Women's fashion emphasized structure and symmetry. Bodices were tight-laced to shape the torso, with long flowing gowns that swept the floor. High waistlines and pointed stomachers drew the eye downward, while elaborate sleeves and headdresses framed the face. Hairstyles ranged from loose curls bound by ribbons to tightly coiled buns beneath jeweled nets. Fabrics were status symbols in themselves. Italian silk, Flemish wool, and Spanish velvet were prized across Europe. Gold thread-embroidered coats and gowns with flowers, heraldic symbols, and religious motifs. Lace, still new in the 16th century, became a luxury accessory, especially around collars and cuffs. Colors held meaning. Black was the color of Spanish nobility, and later of somber elegance across Europe. Deep crimson suggested wealth, as red dyes were costly and complex to produce. Blue, associated with the Virgin Mary, conveyed purity. Green represented youth and love. But fashion was also a battleground. Sumptuary laws, decrees from the church and state, tried to regulate extravagance. In Florence, laws restricted certain fabrics and trims to particular classes. Only nobility could wear ermine. Only the wealthy could afford cloth of gold. These laws were frequently ignored or cleverly subverted. Fashion was not only about society, it was also about the individual. Artists like Bronzino and Holbein painted portraits that immortalized every pleat, brooch, and feather with astonishing detail. These portraits were more than likenesses. They were performances frozen in time. And fashion evolved. By the late Renaissance, Spanish influence had spread dark, stiff, and restrained styles throughout Europe. Ruffs grew wider, skirts grew heavier, and the body was more sculpted than ever before. Yet through all these changes, the Renaissance fascination with form and the body remained central. Clothing did not just cover the body, it celebrated it. It shaped it into ideals of beauty and virtue. It reflected a culture that saw the human figure as divine, expressive, and worthy of artistry. Tonight, let your mind dress itself in velvet and silk. Feel the weight of a jeweled cloak across your shoulders. Hear the rustle of fabric in a candlelit corridor. Let fashion become poetry, woven into dream. Chapter 29. Renaissance Feasts and the Culture of the Table. In the grand halls of palazzos, beneath frescoed ceilings and beside flickering candlelight, the Renaissance expressed itself not only in art and intellect, but in flavor. Food became a ritual of refinement, a ceremony of abundance, order, and sensory delight. The Renaissance table was where culture met appetite. Meals were more than nourishment. They were performances. Hosts arranged courses like compositions, measured, balanced, and aesthetic. Guests gathered not only to eat, but to see and be seen, to speak and to listen, to experience a symphony of taste, texture, and display. In Italy, banquets began with antipasti, olives, marinated vegetables, and cured meats. These gave way to pastas, soups, and stewed dishes, often flavored with spices once worth more than gold. Cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, and saffron arrived through Mediterranean trade, mingling east and west on the tongue. Main courses were often dramatic. Roasted game birds reassembled into their original shapes, peacocks dressed in their feathers, and pies that released doves when opened, a spectacle inherited from medieval court traditions. But Renaissance cooking also pursued subtlety. Sauces reduced to silken glazes, fish delicately poached, herbs chosen with medicinal as well as culinary care. Tableware itself reflected Renaissance craftsmanship. Plates and cups of porcelain or pewter gleamed beside embroidered linens and silver cutlery. In noble homes, eating became ceremonial, each dish carried in with grandeur, each course preceded by perfumed hand-washing and musical interludes. In Florence, the Medici hosted elaborate feasts where poets recited verses between bites. In France, the court of Francis I dined in gardens with tables of sugar sculptures and gold-leafed pastries. In England, banquets were displays of power and wit, where jesters entertained and dishes bore allegorical names like Ambrosia of Apollo. But food was not only for the elite. In towns and villages, a renaissance of agriculture and trade improved diets. Grains, cheeses, legumes, and wine became staples. Street vendors sold fresh bread and roasted chestnuts. Markets bustled with fruits, herbs, and salted fish. Cookbooks began to appear, written in vernacular languages, and filled with recipes, etiquette, and philosophy. Libro di Arte Cocinaria by Maestro Martino and Opera dell'arte del cucinare by Bartolomeo Scappi elevated cooking to an intellectual art. They wrote of elegance and temperance, emphasizing balance in diet as in life.
Dining became a metaphor for Renaissance values: harmony, pleasure, and conversation. The table was a place where body and soul were both fed.
And so tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine a long table beneath a pergola. Imagine the scent of rosemary and roasting meat, the sound of lute music, the quiet laughter of friends in flickering candlelight. Let the feast become your dream, not one of indulgence, but of shared delight. Chapter 30. Printing and the Birth of the Modern Mind. Before the Renaissance, knowledge moved slowly. Books were copied by hand, painstakingly, page by page. Monks labored in dim scriptoria. Manuscripts were treasures, chained to desks, locked in chests. Ideas traveled as whispers across time. But in the mid-15th century, a quiet thunder rolled through Europe. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg. And with it, the Renaissance mind found its wings. Gutenberg's movable type revolutionized the way humans shared information. It allowed for rapid, repeatable, and consistent production of books. His first major work, the Gutenberg Bible, was printed around 1455, majestic, accurate, and beautiful. It proved that the new medium could rival the scribes. From that moment, the written word exploded. By 1500, over 20 million books had been printed across Europe. Cities like Venice, Paris, and Nuremberg became hubs of printing. Printers and publishers joined the ranks of scholars, artisans, and merchants. The press democratized knowledge. Texts once confined to elites could now be owned by merchants, artisans, even peasants. Schools expanded, libraries grew, literacy soared. People began to read, not just to memorize, but to question, reflect, and converse. Humanist works by Erasmus, classical texts in translation, scientific treatises, theological arguments, plays, poems, all flowed from the press like streams from a mountain. The Bible became accessible in local languages, sparking both devotion and dissent. News, once passed by rumor, was printed and distributed. Print also preserved knowledge. Ideas could now survive beyond one city, one school, one lifetime. Scholars corresponded across borders, publishing findings, comparing notes, refining theories. The Renaissance was no longer a place, it became a movement. This change was not without fear. Authorities, both secular and religious, tried to control what could be printed. Censorship was born alongside freedom. Indexes of banned books multiplied. Yet the momentum could not be reversed. The printing press transformed not only what we knew, but how we thought. It encouraged linear reasoning, silent reflection, and individual interpretation. It shifted memory from the oral to the written, from the communal to the personal. It reshaped the brain. And it built the modern world. So as you lie down tonight, think of the press's soft clatter, the ink drying, the paper folding, the hands stacking fresh pages. Imagine the scent of leather bindings and parchment, the rustle of pages turned by candlelight. In that moment, the Renaissance mind woke, and so did we. Chapter 31. Renaissance Medicine, the Body Reimagined. Beneath the marble facades and celestial frescoes of the Renaissance, another kind of exploration was underway, not of stars or saints, but of flesh and blood. It was the rediscovery of the human body, not as a mystery to be feared, but as a system to be studied, healed, and understood. For centuries, European medicine had relied heavily on the teachings of Galen, the Greek physician whose work was preserved and expanded in the Islamic world. But by the 15th and 16th centuries, scholars began to challenge, dissect, and build upon those ancient foundations. One of the most pivotal figures in this transformation was Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish anatomist who dared to question Galen's authority. In 1543, he published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, a groundbreaking work of anatomical precision and visual artistry. Through meticulous dissections and stunning illustrations, Vesalius corrected centuries of misconceptions. He showed that the human body was not as Galen had described, but as it truly was, revealed not through books, but through the blade and the eye. Dissections, once taboo or relegated to the hands of criminals, became part of university education. Surgeons and students gathered in anatomical theatres, where the body became a text to be read, layer by layer, organ by organ. Death, once shrouded in superstition, now served the cause of life. Medicine began to shift from theory to observation. Physicians like Paracelsus challenged the classical four humours model: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and introduced ideas of chemistry into treatment. He believed that diseases had external causes and should be treated with specific remedies, laying early groundwork for toxicology and pharmacology. Hospitals evolved too. No longer just places of isolation, they became centres of care and learning. Monastic infirmaries gave way to civic institutions. Public health efforts, while rudimentary, took root, particularly in response to recurring outbreaks of plague. Yet the Renaissance physician walked a delicate line. Astrology still guided diagnosis. Bloodletting remained common. Superstition coexisted with science. And access to care was deeply unequal, available to the wealthy, limited for the poor. Still, the body was no longer a passive vessel. It was a system to be observed, a puzzle to solve. And in understanding its inner workings, Renaissance thinkers affirmed something profound: that knowledge could heal, that reason could reach even into the pulse of life. Tonight, close your eyes and listen to the heartbeat of this awakening. Picture a scholar hunched over candlelight, sketching veins in crimson ink. Hear the whispers of students in an anatomy hall. Feel the weight of courage it took to question, to cut, to learn. Chapter 32: The Renaissance and the Rise of the Artist. Before the Renaissance, artists were craftsmen, anonymous hands behind cathedral walls and manuscript borders. But during the Renaissance, something shifted. The artist emerged not just as a maker, but as a mind. Not merely a labourer, but a genius. In this cultural rebirth, the artist was elevated to the status of intellectual, philosopher, even prophet. He became a figure of curiosity and reverence, someone who could bridge heaven and earth through vision and skill. Giotto di Bondone was among the first to step into this role. Though still medieval in many ways, Giotto painted with a new emotional realism that stirred viewers. He gave his figures weight, shadow, and presence. They mourned, they loved, they moved, and through this motion, he moved history forward. Later came the Titans: Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo Buonarroti, Raphael Sanzio. Each transcended the boundaries of paint and stone. Leonardo was a polymath, sketching flying machines and dissecting cadavers between fresco sessions. He believed painting was a science, and science an art. His notebooks overflowed with diagrams, inventions, and fragments of thought, his mind too restless to settle in one field. Michelangelo, the sculptor of David and the painter of the Sistine ceiling, wrestled with divinity in every stroke. He chiseled form from marble, as if freeing spirits trapped in stone. He struggled with authority, wrestled with faith, and turned his inner turmoil into timeless beauty. Raphael, the harmonizer, brought grace and serenity. His frescoes in the Vatican glow with intellectual clarity and emotional depth. In his school of Athens, ancient thinkers gather beneath an idealized Roman arch, embodying the union of past and present. And among them stands Raphael himself, no longer a servant, but a peer. Their fame changed the structure of patronage. Artists signed their works. They kept studios, trained apprentices, negotiated contracts. They traveled across courts and countries. Their names carried weight. And not only men. Sophonisba Anguissola earned royal commissions. Lavinia Fontana ran her own workshop. Artemisia Gentileschi painted violence and resilience with unflinching honesty. The Renaissance gave the artist a face and a voice. It revealed that to make art was to make meaning, and that behind every masterpiece was a mind, a soul, and a story. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine a studio bathed in morning light, brushes laid carefully on a wooden table, a canvas waiting, the soft rhythm of pencil on paper. In that quiet, the artist begins, not with certainty, but with wonder. Chapter 33: The Renaissance and the Exploration of the World. As artists painted heavens on ceilings and scholars rediscovered ancient truths, another wave of Renaissance energy unfurled across oceans, into maps, onto ships bound for distant horizons. The age of exploration was not separate from the Renaissance. It was its extension, its expansion from canvas to continent. Curiosity, the fuel of the Renaissance mind, turned outward. European explorers, supported by monarchs and inspired by stories, sought to chart the unknown. Their maps grew more accurate, their ships more daring. Trade routes and coastlines took form, not as myths, but as measurable realities. Portugal led the early charge. Prince Henry the Navigator sponsored voyages down the coast of Africa, gathering data, training navigators, and refining maritime tools. By the late 15th century, Bartolomeu Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and Vasco da Gama reached India, linking Europe to the east by sea. Spain followed swiftly. In 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail westward, seeking Asia. He found instead the Americas, lands rich with people, ecosystems, and complexity that Europe had never known. Though he died believing he had found the edge of Asia, Columbus had opened the door to an age of encounters that would reshape the world. Explorers like Ferdinand Magellan, whose fleet circumnavigated the globe, and Amerigo Vespucci, whose name was given to a continent, expanded the mental map of humanity. Europe, once inward and isolated, now imagined itself part of a globe. This expansion was not just geographical, it was intellectual. New plants, animals, minerals, and cultures challenged European assumptions. Scientific knowledge grew, cartography flourished, trade exploded. But the age also brought tragedy. Colonization led to conquest. Indigenous civilizations, with deep histories of their own, faced violence, enslavement, and disease. The Renaissance spirit of curiosity, when wedded to power, became destructive. The world grew richer in connection, but also darker in suffering. Still, the explorers carried more than weapons. They carried ideas about astronomy, mathematics, and timekeeping. They brought books, instruments, and the Renaissance belief that the world was knowable. As you rest, picture a tall ship under starlight, sails full of wind, a captain studying the horizon. Picture maps unrolling on wooden tables, ink still wet. Feel the tension between wonder and fear, between discovery and loss. In every voyage, a question: what lies beyond? Chapter 34: Renaissance Theatre, the stage of the soul. In candle-lit courtyards and echoing halls, the Renaissance mind took to the stage. There, beneath painted ceilings or open skies, actors brought human longing, folly, and triumph to life. Theatre was not only entertainment, it was reflection, a mirror held up to nature. The Renaissance inherited dramatic traditions from the ancient Greeks and Romans, rediscovered through humanist study, but it transformed them, blending classical structure with new emotion and insight. In Italy, playwrights like Ludovico Ariosto and Torquato Tasso wrote comedies and epics that played with language and character. Commedia dell'arte, a form of improvised theatre with stock characters like Harlequin and Pantalone, brought humour and satire to town squares. With masks, gestures and rapid wit, it spoke not to kings, but to the crowd. But it was in England that Renaissance drama found one of its greatest voices, William Shakespeare. Born in 1564, Shakespeare wrote plays that spanned genres and hearts, tragedies like Hamlet and Macbeth, comedies like Twelfth Night, histories like Henry V, and romances like The Tempest. He understood people, their ambitions, their wounds, their dreams. In his Globe Theatre, peasants and nobles alike watched actors stride across the stage, sword in hand or heart in turmoil. The language soared, yet remained grounded in everyday truth. "All the world's a stage," he wrote, and on that stage, every emotion could be explored. Love, envy, hope, betrayal. Elsewhere in Europe, theatre also thrived. In Spain, Lope de Vega and Calderón de la Barca spun tales of honour and destiny. In France, the classical unities were revived and refined. Theatre became both national art and communal voice. Stages were simple, wooden platforms, painted backdrops, few props. But the words and gestures filled the space. The audience became part of the story. Laughter, gasps, and applause wove actors and viewers into one. Theatre was also a place of danger. It tested the limits of expression. Political satire, religious themes, and gender roles were often challenged. Women were rarely allowed to perform, yet their characters grew in complexity and presence. To attend a play was to enter another world, a world shaped not by force, but by imagination. And in that world, people saw themselves not as saints or sinners, but as both. Tonight, let your dreams unfold like a play. Imagine the hush before the curtain, the flicker of torches, the murmur of the crowd. Step onto the stage and let your story begin. Chapter 35, The Renaissance and the Book of Nature. For centuries, nature had been a source of awe, fear, and superstition. Forests were dark and mysterious, stars were signs from God, and illness was the result of imbalance or sin. But during the Renaissance, something profound began to change. Nature became a book, a text to be read, studied, and interpreted. No longer merely symbolic, it became empirical, observed, measured, described. The world was no longer enchanted only by mystery, but by reason. Leonardo da Vinci, perhaps more than any other figure, embodied this transformation. His notebooks overflowed with sketches of birds in flight, eddies in rivers, the branching of trees. He saw patterns in everything. For him, nature was the ultimate architect, and he, its apprentice. Naturalists began to catalogue the world. Botanists recorded plants with meticulous precision. Anatomists studied organs and systems. Zoologists described species never seen before in Europe. Taxonomy took root. Herbals, books of plant knowledge, combined medical wisdom with detailed illustrations. The invention of the microscope in the early 17th century, though slightly beyond the Renaissance, was prepared by its spirit. It confirmed what Renaissance thinkers had begun to suspect, that the smallest things could contain the greatest wonders. Astronomers, too, read the heavens as a book. Copernicus and Galileo studied celestial motion not through myth, but through mathematics. The moon was no longer a goddess, but a rocky sphere. The stars, no longer angels, became suns. This shift, from symbolic to scientific, was not cold. It was deeply poetic.
Renaissance thinkers did not discard beauty. They found it in the structures of reality. They believed that to understand the world was to praise its maker more fully.
This was the Renaissance at its core, not the replacement of faith with reason, but the marriage of the two. Nature was no longer feared. It was a friend, a teacher, a marvel. So tonight, as you drift away, think of a leaf pressed between book pages, a sketch of a shell beside a candle, a telescope pointed at Jupiter. Feel the quiet excitement of discovery, the joy of understanding the world, not through magic, but through wonder. Chapter 36. Music of the Renaissance. Harmony reborn. If the Renaissance was a rebirth of the mind and the eye, it was also a renaissance of the ear. In chapels and courts, in echoing cathedrals and candle-lit salons, music flowed like a second language, one of devotion, elegance, and innovation. Before the Renaissance, much of Europe's music was monophonic, single melodic lines sung in chant. But with the 15th century came polyphony, voices intertwining like vines, each distinct yet harmonious. It was the sound of complexity made beautiful. Mathematics turned to melody. Composers such as Guillaume Dufay and Johannes Ockeghem began to craft intricate vocal works. They blended sacred texts with flowing rhythms and carefully layered harmonies. The Mass became a musical masterpiece, not only a ritual. Music was now not just for praising, it was for contemplating. Then came Josquin des Prez, whose works were sung in the Vatican and across the courts of Europe. His compositions, filled with emotion and structure, lifted the human voice to new heights. He played with echo, imitation, and space, making the listener feel enveloped by sound. The invention of music printing in the early 1500s helped this art flourish. Composers could share their scores far and wide. Choirs could learn and preserve songs. Music left the abbey and entered the parlor. Secular music thrived as well. The madrigal emerged, love songs and poetic texts set to music, performed by small ensembles in private gatherings. These songs often danced between melancholy and joy, capturing the emotional sophistication of the age. Instruments grew more refined. The lute became a favorite among aristocrats, its soft plucking the background to many a midnight reverie. The viol, harpsichord, recorder, and early versions of the violin began to appear in ensembles. Music was not just heard. It was played, shared, taught. And while much of this world was still male-dominated, women also composed, performed, and influenced the musical landscape. Noble women played in salons, nuns composed within convents, and some even published under their names. A rare but powerful act of voice. Music in the Renaissance was not merely art. It was mathematics, prayer, courtship, philosophy. It touched every aspect of life, from birth to death, from mass to masque. As you prepare for sleep, hear it now. A choir under stone arches, their voices blending and rising. A lute in a quiet garden. A soft hum at a windowsill. Let the music of this world surround you, not with noise, but with harmony. Chapter 37. Renaissance Children and the World of Learning. In the quiet corners of Renaissance households and schools, another kind of transformation unfolded, not in marble or manuscript, but in minds just beginning to open. Childhood, once seen as brief and utilitarian, was rediscovered as a time of growth, potential, and education. This was the first era in European history to deeply consider what it meant to teach a child, not just to obey, but to think. Humanist educators like Vittorino de Feltre believed that learning should be joyful and holistic. At his Casa Gioiosa, the House of Joy, students studied Latin and Greek, yes, but also mathematics, music, ethics, and physical exercise. He taught boys of noble and modest birth alike, insisting that virtue was as important as grammar. Elsewhere, Erasmus of Rotterdam advocated for gentle instruction. In his On the Education of a Christian Prince, he argued that rulers should be molded not by fear, but by reason and love of wisdom. He translated classical works for children and wrote textbooks filled with dialogue and humor. Education was still a privilege, mostly for boys and mostly for the upper class. But girls, too, were increasingly taught to read, especially in humanist households. Some, like the brilliant Isotta Nogarola and the poet Laura Tsarita, used their learning to argue for women's intellectual equality. They wrote letters, essays, and dialogues in Latin, challenging the very assumptions of their time. Children were seen in portraits for the first time not as miniature adults, but as themselves, playful, curious, vulnerable. In the paintings of the era, they hold pets, wear age-appropriate clothes, or gaze shyly at the viewer. Artists like Ghirlandaio and Holbein captured them with tenderness. Games and toys were also documented, wooden dolls, spinning tops, and board games. Even education had its play. Learning to write involved drawing shapes and letters in sand or wax before pen met parchment. Moral instruction remained important. Books like The Book of the Courtier and conduct literature aimed to mold character as much as intellect. Children were taught not just to read, but to behave gracefully, honestly, wisely. The Renaissance child was no longer merely an apprentice in waiting. They were a promise, a soul to be cultivated, a future citizen of a better world. Tonight, as the day closes, picture a sunlit study with open windows, a child tracing letters on a slate, a tutor reading aloud from Cicero, the rustle of paper, the scent of ink, the sparkle of wonder in young eyes. Let that quiet promise carry you into sleep, a reminder that all greatness begins in learning, and every age begins in a child's heart. Chapter 38. The Decline of the Renaissance. Shifting Tides. All golden ages fade. By the late 16th century, the Renaissance, once vibrant and ascendant, began to dim. Not in a sudden collapse, but in a gradual transformation, its energies shifting, its certainties questioned, its style evolving into something new. One reason was political. Italy, once a mosaic of flourishing city-states, fell prey to foreign powers. Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire vied for control. Florence lost its independence. Rome was sacked in 1527. The freedom that had nurtured artistic innovation gave way to instability and repression. Religious upheaval also played a role. The Protestant Reformation fractured Europe's spiritual unity. In response, the Catholic Church launched the Counter-Reformation, a movement of reform and reaffirmation. Art was now required to teach, to inspire, to conform. The freedom of form and exploration gave way to stricter guidelines. In this climate, the Renaissance style evolved into mannerism. Artists like Pontormo, Parmigianino, and Bronzino distorted proportions, intensified colors, and embraced complexity. Their work was elegant, even virtuosic, but also mannered, introspective, uneasy. Elsewhere, the seeds of the Baroque began to sprout. Emotion, drama, and movement returned to art. Architects built with bold curves and golden light. Painters like Caravaggio and Rubens embraced chiaroscuro and theatricality. The Renaissance's calm order gave way to the Baroque's passionate dynamism. Science, too, was changing. Copernicus had questioned the heavens. Galileo would challenge the earth. Bacon and Descartes were crafting new methods of inquiry. The Renaissance belief in balance and humanism began to yield to a more analytical, mechanical worldview. And yet, the Renaissance did not vanish. Its spirit of learning, discovery, beauty, and curiosity continued to pulse through the centuries. It had reshaped Europe's mind, eyes, and heart. What declined was not the Renaissance itself, but the moment in which it flourished, a time when art, thought, and faith danced together in harmony. That moment passed, but its echoes remained. Chapter 39, The Legacy of the Renaissance in the Modern World. Though the Renaissance as a historical period faded into the Baroque, its legacy endured and endures still. It was not simply an era of brilliant art and letters. It was a turning point in how humans saw themselves and their place in the cosmos. The Renaissance reawakened a sense of individual dignity. The idea that a person could shape their own destiny, cultivate their own mind, and express their unique perspective gained power. This notion of the self would influence modern thought, politics, and identity. Its rediscovery of classical texts and ideals laid the foundation for the Enlightenment. Reason, skepticism, civic virtue, and secular governance all drew from the Renaissance well. Philosophers like Locke, Voltaire, and Rousseau stood on ground prepared by Erasmus, Machiavelli, and Montaigne. Renaissance humanism transformed education. The liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy became core to Western curricula. They were not taught merely to make scholars, but to shape whole persons, citizens, thinkers, and creators. Science, too, was reborn. The Renaissance challenged passive acceptance of tradition. It encouraged observation, experimentation, and the belief that nature could be understood through human inquiry. This mindset would give rise to the scientific revolution, the industrial age, and beyond. In politics, the Renaissance offered both warnings and hopes. Machiavelli revealed the workings of power. Thomas More imagined utopia. Their insights shaped modern concepts of state, justice, and reform. Artistically, the Renaissance never left. Its techniques, perspective, anatomy, oil painting remain foundational. Its masterpieces are still studied, revered, and displayed. Its cathedrals, palaces, and piazzas still draw pilgrims of beauty. Even its tensions remain relevant. The struggle between faith and reason, the balance of individual freedom and collective order, the pursuit of truth amid complexity. We walk through a world shaped by the Renaissance, often without realizing it. In our universities, museums, democracies, and dreams, we are its heirs. Chapter 40. Reflections. What the Renaissance teaches us. As the echoes of this age grow fainter, we are left with its lessons, not in dusty volumes or museum halls, but in questions that still stir the soul. The Renaissance teaches us to look back, not to retreat, but to remember, to draw from the well of the past, not to repeat it, but to enrich the present, to stand, as its thinkers did, with one foot in antiquity and the other in a yet unwritten future. It teaches us the value of synthesis, that faith and reason, art and science, body and spirit, need not be enemies, that the human mind is most alive when it embraces complexity, contradiction, and connection. It reminds us that beauty matters, not as ornament, but as insight. Beauty opens the heart, it softens certainty, it invites wonder, It warns us, too, that progress is fragile, that knowledge can be silenced, that freedom, once found, must be guarded, that golden ages do not last, but their light can guide. Perhaps most of all, the Renaissance invites us to be curious, to learn not for gain, but for growth, to ask, seek, create, to imagine a better world, and then begin to build it.
The men and women of that age did not see themselves as special. They simply dared to ask, what if? What if we read the old books? What if we painted what we saw? What if we questioned? What if we dreamed?
In those questions, they changed the world. Chapter 41. Fall asleep to the Renaissance, a final word. Now as you rest, let the Renaissance drift through your thoughts, not as a list of names and dates, but as a feeling. A hush before dawn, a candle in a scholar's hand, a sketch of a flying machine, a chord sung in stone vaults, a woman reading under an open window. Picture a Florentine street, paved with centuries, where footsteps echo like memories. Picture an artist standing before a blank wall, imagining the ceiling of the world. Picture a poet composing in candlelight, a monk copying a text, a sailor watching the stars. Let the rhythm of the Renaissance be your lullaby, the rhythm of wonder, of learning, of longing. Let it remind you that humanity, in all its mess and glory, has always sought meaning, always tried to create, always reached for light. The Renaissance is not a relic, it is a promise that we can rise from darkness, shape new worlds, and, through knowledge and beauty, glimpse the divine. Sleep now. Let your dreams walk among domes and altars, colonnades and canvases. Rest in the hush of libraries and the music of stars. And when you wake, carry a little of the Renaissance with you, always.